figure there's likely too many people will be traveling or out or anything. We won't have class next Saturday through at least the start of the new year. So we'll either start on the 2nd, and I don't know how many people will be available for class then, or we'll start on the 6th. Probably more likely we'll start on the 6th, so that if people are still traveling or taking a longer break, they've got a little bit of a window there. Anyway, I heard, yeah, it sounded like most of you are at least close to, if not in the NoteStore NoteActions chapter already. So that's great. And like I was saying, I think this is really useful in putting together these concepts of Flux. So I still have this guide up that we used, which we will revisit as we talk about what these different parts of the code that actually written up are doing. And then hopefully it'll clarify some different aspects. But I guess before I start going through it with a little bit of the approach I was thinking of, are there any big questions people had that they ran across in this chapter? Anything that was not clear so far? Not sure. All right, so I guess we'll just go ahead and step through some of this content for the chapter then. So remember this Flux implementation in general, the way that you think about Flux is you've got your views, which are your React components traditionally. And those, you also have stores. So these are sort of the, if you will, the entities, the objects that exist in your model that contain information. And so the way that views get updated with new content is they use an action creator to create an action of some kind. That action gets sent through the dispatcher, which dispatches that action to the stores that care about it and do something with it. And then the views are bound to the stores so that when the store changes, the view re-renders as well. So given that, and the pretty obvious title of this chapter, what do you think we're focusing on? Which portions of that Flux flow are we building out in this chapter? And the stores and the actions, right? That's what we're really focusing on here. And so the first thing that we do at the start of this chapter is set up this NoteStore. And this isn't doing anything particularly different than what we were doing before inside of our app itself. The only difference is we pulled this notes object out of our app component where it was being created as part of the state and are just creating it somewhere separately. All of this syntax, everything in here, this is just ES6 object syntax. So this is how you can declare, one of the ways to declare a class in ES6 so that you can create objects. And it shouldn't be too unfamiliar to you. We've encountered similar stuff. We haven't talked a lot about this constructor concept, but we've discussed it a little bit. That's what gets called when you create an instance of a class. So when you create an object off that class, it calls this constructor to initialize it and set everything up. So I hope at least that portion is pretty simple and straightforward, right? Not too confusing. Should be stuff that we've seen a lot of before. And this dot notes, well, that's just pulling over exactly what we had before. So the next bit is a little bit of this magic of alt and hooking some of this stuff up. This is where we're starting to hook up these different parts. So this is setting up some of these connections here between different portions of the application. Make sure I am. Yeah, I am live. All right. So before in this setup.js file, we weren't hooking anything up for our alt. And if you remember where this is called, hold on, I think it's at this level. No. Oh, might be in our provider. So I don't even remember this. Oh, here we go. All right. So yeah, it's in the implementation of the provider. This is when we call setup. And what we're passing in is our alt instance. So some sort of alt object. And this is being used so that we can do some initialization of this alt store. And the initialization we're now doing, before we were doing nothing because we weren't putting anything into the store. Now what we're doing is adding in a store of some kind into this larger alt structure. So alt can keep track of all the different stores of data that you will have in your application, and you can register them into it. That's essentially what's going on here. Alt's got this list of stores that you might want to update. Now, right now, we just have the one store, the NoteStore. But as we talked about, yes? Oh. Yeah. As we talked about last time, right, we could have other stores for different pieces of data in our application. So if we wanted to create another piece of data that isn't, first off, let me create a new branch here so I don't so many changes I make, I can just delete really easily. So let's say we want to create another store because we also want to have settings for our application, another piece of data. We could easily just create a settings store, and it's not hard to take the existing code that we have from our NoteStore, this constructor type logic, and start setting up a settings store that looks very similar. All right, well, it's not a NoteStore, it's a settings store, and we don't have any actions yet that we're binding. And then maybe there are some settings for our application. And it's probably not going to be an array. It's going to be some sort of object, and we might have a theme setting. Maybe it could be a dark or light theme. And we might have a font size setting. And let's say we go with sort of a default of 16. So if we've created I think I need one more here. If we've created this settings store and we're exporting it, if we wanted to have that hooked up into our alt as another store, we could add it in the same way we did this. Just alt.add store settings store, and then settings store. The problem here is this file doesn't yet know about the settings store object, so I would have to import it up here. And that's perfectly, I mean, that's how you can add different pieces, at least in an alt type or a Flux type configuration. If you have different data that really is separate, you can hook up different stores like this. So that's all we're doing in this setup at this point. And then what we do in our app.jsx is a big change, right? So in app.jsx, we used to have all of the logic for our notes in our constructor because it was holding on to it in the state. Well, the change we made is it's getting bound instead, connect. It's connecting to notes this sort of notes object, and then binding that into our app. This is probably one of the more confusing bits. Again, that's why we spent a lot of time talking about connect in the last class in terms of what's going on when you're putting together an alt structure like this. So let me check something here. Wrong libs. So here's the connect that we built before. And remember, it takes a state and actions. And so that state object, this connect is bound up to alt, so it's getting that state from the alt stores. And since the alt stores are set up here, and it's got a NoteStore already bound, this is able to, there's one bit here that confused even me. I want to look in all files. And I can't remember how to do it in here. Anyways, which is, why does it, I feel like I don't have anything bound directly to this NoteStore portion. So I set up the NoteStore in alt, but then my app, when it's connecting, is connecting to, it's getting notes out, not the NoteStore.notes or something like that, which is sort of what I expected. So I think either I'm missing something here and there's a step I missed while looking over all this, or alt is sort of collapsing all these different store things so you can pull off the individual properties that come from them directly, like notes, without having to reference the different stores that it's holding on to.
If you wanted settings, only the store that you set up settings, how would you?
This is the part where I really haven't looked into exactly how alt works with that. I'm guessing. So let's try this out and see if something works here. And this is gonna be just some live, I don't know. Let's try and find out. All right, so let's do some settings and let's just add something so we'll be able to see something about settings here, right? Div font size is this dot props dot settings dot font size. Find out if this works now. Oh, it blew up all over me. Can't render font size of undefined, so they couldn't pull the settings off directly. So I am missing something here that I just missed. And I don't know where that's happening at. Originally I thought it was at the index, which is why I go up here. Here we've got our provider, and then we render our app. So we're walking down through the code. And our app, this doesn't have anything that directly binds it to the notes bit. It just does a connect on notes and setting, NoteActions app. Let me check here again. Oh, wait. Might have missed something here. There we go. Yeah, I just missed passing it in. So what's going, it is doing a little bit of magic inside of all what's going. It's collapsing all the different stores so that you can treat them all as sort of one object, and that's what it passes into this store for the connect, which is this whole first argument. And then what you get is the object passed in, and this is just being very lazy shorthand where we stripped off the notes and settings directly from this object and just returned an object with notes and settings. You almost wonder, why do you need to do that? It's a little bit of a boilerplate if all you're doing is passing stuff directly like that. And the reason would be very clear if we weren't using part of the store in a portion of our application, which we can show a little bit later. But if we did have settings and this portion of the application didn't care about settings, then you wouldn't pull settings in. And that way, any components that don't pull that store in won't be re-rendered if that store changes. That's like, right now it's like, oh, I'm just pulling everything in, but that's why you hook up to exactly the portions of the store that you care about, I guess. That's a way to say that. So that's the biggest change that we made so far in the app, right? That's probably the bigger change than anything else, is now instead of our data being stored locally, it's pulling it using this connect function. Yes?
So the only difference between connect and listen is that connect is pulling specific information from the store.
What do you mean listen?
Well, I was looking at a tutorial and it was explaining Flux, and they used the term listen.
I think it's just a different term,
okay,
most likely. There's a lot of language that you'll see that's very similar, because there's a lot of, what I'll say is, there's what I call a very common pattern in computer science that uses a whole bunch of different terms depending on where you encounter it. And that pattern is just the idea of like a publish subscribe pattern in the highest level, where one thing can publish events of some kind and something else can be subscribed to get notified when those happen. And so that's sort of the concept level. And some things use that terminology, like, oh, this publishes these events, this guy subscribed to those events, and that determines what happens. Oh, now he can do something when that event occurs, and this one publishes it. So in some places you'll encounter that more generic language, but a lot of different libraries, a lot of different things use specific language that you could probably think of as being very, very similar. So listen is very similar to being subscribed to something. And connect is a little different than listen, because connect is doing more than just listen. If you wanted to, you could potentially break this connect function down so that it's doing only one thing, and you could do each one of those steps individually, but you usually, most of the implementations you'll encounter don't. Right now, it's only doing the equivalent of a listen. That's all that's happening in here right now. Or that's all that was happening up till this point in the tutorial. But we're going to add in the next step in just a minute that makes it different than a pure listen function. Is everything sort of clear up through there?
That's why I know now, because I looked at like 3 or 4 tutorials on Flux. Now I can
right.
Just like you said, terminology.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things, and it happens to me all the time, is don't get stuck up. Don't get stuck on terminology, like specific terminology, and learn to try and understand the concept behind it. There's things that I've gotten stuck on for long periods of time. I was having a conversation with coworkers this week that there's a term in object-oriented programming called an interface, and you implement interfaces and do all this stuff, and I'm like, I pretty much didn't understand. I knew what they were, but they always caused me problems. I wish that they were called contracts, because to me, calling it a contract would make so much more sense than calling it an interface. But was me getting hung up on the terminology that slowed down my understanding of a specific aspect of programming. And that's why it can be really useful sometimes to look at some other descriptions of things, because it may use some different terminology that might shake loose that, oh, I'm stuck on this notion. So what's going on now is we haven't, at this point in this tutorial, right, if we're walking through this, we haven't hooked anything up to take any of these actions. What we've hooked up so far is that this NoteStore, or our app, is now rendering notes from the props of notes, and that's coming from the NoteStore and not from internal to the app. So that's what we've done at this point. So if we go back and we look at our Flux guide here, what we did with this connect so far was essentially hook up this piece right here. The store is now connected to our view, so that the view gets its data from the store, and that's how it's rendered. But what we haven't hooked up yet is the ability for the view to dispatch an action. How does the view fire off an action to change the store? So right now, at this point in the tutorial, nothing in the store ever changes because none of those other bits are hooked up. And that's where we start going, in a sense, in the next step here. He's got a little section on understanding actions versus action creators. And that's, I mean, useful to read, but not particularly fundamental, I feel like. So I wouldn't worry about it too much.
That's part of when we were talking about
And triggering actions, yeah. I mean, yeah, I'll try and give you some other examples of actions, but I think it'll make a lot more sense also as we show the alt developer tools and what's going on. So the next step in this whole thing is setting up the NoteActions, because we've set up our store. We've created our store. We've done the binding between the store and the view, so that the view is rendered off the store. But we haven't yet set up the actual actions that we're able to dispatch to update our store. Nothing exists. And that's where we can use this alt.generateActions helper method to create these actions. And this is where this maps pretty close to a concept from just about every framework that you're going to encounter. So it sort of almost gets glossed over here, but one of the really useful notions that you'll see shared a lot when you're talking about web frameworks or anything that's updating data is this concept of CRUD. And that just stands for create, read, update, and delete. So you can think of just about any piece of data that you want to represent in any application. There's 4 different actions that you want to take on that data. You either want to create new data, which in our notes actions or our notes, what would a create action do? Create a new note, right? You want to read the data that's already there, and we already set that up by hooking up this store and view. That lets us read the data. So that's sort of implicitly happening pretty easily. You want to be able to update your data in some way. And so, for example, that's editing our note or anything like that. And you want to be able to delete something, deleting our note, right? So just about every web framework that you'll ever encounter, or every framework that involves working with data in some way, will have this concept of these actions that exist. Sometimes they map directly to CRUD type actions. Sometimes they're a little bit different. But that's one of the core things. If you're ever trying to pick up a different framework, try and look at how they're doing these actions. How do you create something, read it, update, delete it? And that'll really help accelerate your understanding of any framework that you're learning. And in this case, alt gives us a very nice shorthand, so we don't have to write out the functions for all of these things. it lets us do this alt.generate actions shorthand to create, update, and delete methods. Pardon me. So that's incredibly useful because we didn't have to write out a whole bunch of boilerplate, create, update, and delete. What that's actually doing behind the scenes is just sort of informing the alt store that these are the actions that it supports. These are actions that you are allowed to handle in some way and that can be created and used for from other portions of the application. So it's just sort of creating a contract of these are the messages I understand, if you will. We could easily have created other ones. So let's, in this model where we're making something, we're adding something else to the app today while we're doing this. Let's add a settings actions file. And we had our note actions. Let's create the settings actions, but this doesn't seem like create, update, and delete are really the actions that we have for our settings actions, right? What type of, if these are the settings that we have a theme that you might change and like a font size, what might be some of the actions that we would have for the settings store? You can, anything with those?
Changing color.
We could have a change theme, right? I don't know. Change theme action. It works. What? Anything else?
Change font.
Oh, yeah, change font size. I mean, I don't know if we have other stuff or not, but I mean, that's a couple that sort of jump out at me, right? So those could be actions that you could also have. So you're not tied to, when you're setting up your actions, having to name them, create, update, and delete. These ones, they just did that, sort of introduce this CRUD, and because the only actions that we have right now are these note actions, so we don't need to be more specific, but now suddenly we have to be a little bit more specific because we could call this update font size if we want, so it follows that same naming convention. Update theme. So these are sort of update type actions, but they're more specific. They're updating a specific subportion of the application in some way. All right. Does it make sense? Like I said, I think this chapter really does a good job of clarifying the last chapter as you work through it. So if we have these actions, this is where we hook up the next part. So going back again, we've got our store that we created. We already had our views. We've bound this. Now what we're creating are the actions, which it's sort of weird to say, but it's a lot easier to think of those actions as living here in this in between the action and dispatcher, because you don't really do a lot to create them, whereas you might do more to create the action creators. And the way we bind those actions so that this component knows what actions can I dispatch in some way is using this connect function second argument, which is actions. So in this case, we're getting the note actions, and that's what we're passing into it so that it knows about note actions that can be taken. Well, these are the note actions are the ones that we created for the note. And so the note actions are create, update, and delete. And that's what's bound up in this note actions portion here. We just passed in I'm going to rewrite this or show you another example of this that might make it a little more clear what's going on with this connect. Thinking about it from other React components after we get all of this in. So now we have note actions that we've added in. now let's say we want to add in our actions to the settings actions, because this application might want to change the settings as well. How can we add that in? I can pull up the code here for what changed in the existing one when we added in the NoteActions.
We write it just similar to that, but did you say no actions, common settings?
Yeah, we can add the settings actions right down here. All right. Let me break this out onto a separate line so that let's see what happens if I do this. Ooh, we get an error. Settings actions is not defined. There's one thing we're missing. Yes, we forgot to import our settings actions into this file. So this file doesn't know about settings actions because we haven't told it, oh, here's another file with actions that you can use. Yeah, you got to make sure that file knows about it. And so we need to tell it about it, right? So let's import our settings actions from the settings actions file. Now let's see. We look good, compiled successfully. Awesome. So now if we break down again this connect function, it's got these two arguments. First one is the store and what we're being bound to for the store. What do we care about when the store changes? We care when the notes change or the settings change. And then the next one is what type of actions do I want to bind to this app component so that it can take those actions and make changes to the store by dispatching those. And here we're saying, ooh, any of the note actions or setting actions, those are ones we want to be able to dispatch.
Can you bind certain actions to certain stores, or is it also?
That's a good question. Yes and no. So it can depend. It depends on the type of Flux you're using, but what happens and we haven't really gotten to the store and how it handles an action when it comes in yet, because what we're doing here is just creating actions. We haven't yet dispatched them, and how does the store handle them? The way Flux works, and I think Alt by default, and I think it's just the way most of these work, is every store gets any action that gets dispatched. But the store can essentially say, these are the only actions I care about and change. And if it's not one of those actions, then I don't change my data. So it gets all the actions, but it might just go, I'm just giving you back the same thing. Nothing changed from me. Right? So you can hook up any actions you want here. And this is where I'm going to take a moment and sort of rewrite this just a little bit, so that maybe it'll make a little more sense. Or let's create a bound app component. And let's imagine this guy imported our app component from app. And what this bound app, remember we talked about this idea of a very common pattern is to create a component that just changes some properties or passes in some additional properties to another component in the last class. Like our tabs were an example where we might do that. The active tab or the current tab. This bound app component, let's say that he already knows all about how to talk to the stores. He knows that the stores exist. So he got all of that information somehow, or he sets it all up. if we want to, we could have him be the state management for all this type of stuff, right? So he's got the store. So inside of here, we'll just go ahead and assign some variables for that. Let NoteActions equals this dot, or since this is just a function version and we're passing in some, it's just getting props. Props dot NoteActions. Let settings actions equal props dot settings actions. And then just a moment. Notes and settings. All right. Let notes equal props dot notes. Let settings equal props dot settings. So this is, let's just say, oh, these got passed into this guy. So he already knew about them. This is essentially, I wrote this wrong. These have to be curly braces. This is a lot like what this connect function is doing. So this looks a lot like what happens out of that connect function. Is this guy then returns the app component, and he just passes through whatever props, like whatever things were going to go into app already, which is a little hard for us to do with this syntax. So let's just act like that happens. But he also explicitly sets note actions on the app equals the note actions here. And settings actions equals settings actions. And notes equals notes. And settings equals settings. So now, if you called this bound app version, instead of app directly, this app now has knowledge of note actions, settings actions, and notes and settings. That is essentially what's happening as a result of this connect function, because the last thing it does is take in this app component. And the only place that this app component is called, well, it's never called directly. We're never actually calling this class directly. We're not even exporting this class. So nothing outside of here can render that directly. All it can render is what we return from our export, which is the wrapped version of it, which is equivalent to this bound app or wrapped app or whatever you'd want to call it, which now has notes and settings being fed into it from the store, and note actions and settings actions being fed into it. It's not significantly different from the way that previously the app itself was creating the settings in its state, or the notes, and passing them down into our notes. So that's very much a similar pattern. And that's pretty much all that this connect function is doing. It's just pre-binding some items so that your app is going to know about those. So at this point, I'm going to go a little bit different from the way the book went, which is, I think this is the perfect point to start looking at what's actually happening. We've got our app bound up. It has access to the notes. It has access to the note actions. So give me a moment. I'm going to comment out some code. I don't know if this is going to work. We'll see. Comment this stuff out so it's not implemented yet. And then go back up into my app here. All right. So now let's go over to this demo again. And I'm going to pull up the alt developer tools, because this is where stuff, to me, starts to really make sense. And what I did here as well was I left the old code there of what we were doing before for these. So let's say we have the add note, right? Previously, well, let's get rid of all this comment because that's just sort of getting in the way. Our old code was this set state code right here. But now we have this .props.NoteActions.create that gets passed into our app, and that's getting passed in from this connect function. In fact, I'm even going to simplify this for the time being. Let's do this more simply because we haven't implemented anything. So what happens if I call that directly? Now I'm not passing anything in because it doesn't do anything with it. We didn't implement the other portion yet. And then add note, we know add note gets called when I click my add note button. So let's take a look here. To start off with, what stores do we have? Oh, we've got a note store and this new settings store we just added. The notes store is what we really care about. And when I click this button, it dispatched a create action. Now that create action didn't do anything because we didn't bind anything up in the store. But just by having, we already declared the actions over here in our, not here. Get rid of some of this. We already declared the actions over here in NoteActions, right? So that's how it knows, the store knows about them, or that's how alt knows about them. And here in our app.jsx, we bound those NoteActions here so we were able to invoke it. And then whenever we click that button, it goes ahead and invokes that action on our store. So our store knows that we're dispatching this action. And we can do that again and again, and every time we click that button, it fires off this action another time. So now if we go look at our pipeline here, we have this entire pipeline is actually in place at this point. We've sort of finished the whole pipeline. We've got our views, which we hooked up to our store. They're being rendered off of it. And when we click that button, that's what's using the action creator to dispatch the action. The action gets dispatched, and we know the action's being dispatched because we're seeing it listed as dispatched right here. The only thing that's not happening, and you don't have to do it for everything, is we're not changing our store yet when we dispatch the action. That's the one piece of information, thing that we're missing. But again, every store isn't going to change with every action. So we sort of have this whole pipeline in place, just not the change bit here when we do care about it. Does that make a lot of sense at all? That's why I think looking at these dev tools are a huge help when you're looking at this, because it helps you visualize what's going on. You click this, it dispatches the action and potentially makes changes. So now that's where I think it makes more sense to look at that approach before we go into actually updating stuff. But he starts with connecting the NoteActions and the NoteStore first, which isn't, to me that's the next step, because why would I connect these things if I don't already know that I'm getting stuff dispatched correctly in some way so that anything could happen? And then he talks about, all right, there's a few ways to connect your NoteActions and NoteStore. And this goes to what you were asking about earlier. Does every store have to care about every action? And the answer is no. And here's 3 different ways to essentially tell a store to care about actions of some kind. So the first way, and a couple of these, I'd say these first 2 are alt specific. And this last one, this is pretty much the pattern you use in like Redux, although there are wrappers to make this a little less verbose. So this .bind actions, You can bind a specific action to a specific method. You can also do this bind actions, note actions. For anyone who's written a bunch of Rails code, this is doing a little bit of convention work, some magic, if you will, behind the scenes of connecting things up. And I'll talk about that in the code a little more, but that part can be confusing if you've never encountered something that does that magic. Or you can explicitly hook stuff up using this reduce approach. I'm going to ignore this for the time being because it's more verbose, although it's the approach that you would use in a typical Redux application. And in here we do this dot bind actions, which is using this convention approach. So what you'll see is this dot bind actions, note actions is what's being done in our constructor for our NoteStore. And when it says that there's a convention that's taking place there, what it means is, let's go look at our note actions again. What are the 3 different note actions that we have? Create, update, delete, right? So those exact strings, the convention is it looks at the note actions, the individual actions on the object that you passed in when you use this bind actions this way. Oh. And it says, oh, if there are methods on my object with those exact same names, then I'm automatically going to bind that action to invoking that method when that action is received. So that's really nice because it saved us a lot of boilerplate. I'll show you real fast how you would have written this out otherwise if we didn't have this. And it doesn't seem that bad at first, but it definitely gets worse as it scales. So if we didn't have this little bit of boilerplate here, or this little bit of code here, we would have to write it out like this using their other bind actions approach. This dot bind actions, note actions dot create, and then I want to bind that to create in here. I think I'm supposed to use a quoted string. Oh no, this dot create. All right. And then I would have to write this dot bind actions, note actions dot update, this dot update. Well, this is getting tiresome already. You can begin to see the pattern, right? I'm just writing the same thing out every time. I can do it for delete as well. And then in a lot of stores like this, you don't have 3 actions. The store that we have in one of our applications has about 60 different actions that can be taken. So there's a lot of boilerplate that you end up having to write out. That's what this convention bit saves you, is it actually looks at your code, says, oh, you've got these functions that you passed in as actions, so I'll just assume that I'll bind those to similar methods in this object. And so then we can go ahead and implement these methods bit by bit. I'm not going to update the store at first. I'll leave it the way was it first, where we're just logging something. Let's just make sure that we're actually firing off that action. And that's about, because we already, for the create note, we're already dispatching it, or we're calling that action inside of our app. Now we should be able to see, I may have to update the code and we'll see. Nope, you can see create note null. It went ahead and logged what we passed in. But null is the note here, and that's because currently we're not passing anything in. So let's change that and we'll pass in something valid of some kind. Try this again. I may need to update this. Let me see. Create note and the note object that we're creating. So now we have the full, go back again, the full pipeline implemented here. we're firing off an action, we're dispatching it, we're hitting the store, and the store is doing something with it. The only thing is it's not doing what we want it to do. We really want it to create a new note. That's the easy part, sort of. We just take our existing code that we had before, which was setting the state when we had our state in our component directly. And now we're just going to change our notes directly here because that's where our notes are, is in this store instead. And now we're able to add new notes every time we click the button. And we didn't have to do anything extra at this point to render those notes or change what's going on with the rendering because we already hooked that up. We already told the app that you're connected to the notes data and the settings data from this application. So when this notes object changes and that notes object is here and we're changing it here when we create a new one, re-render this app component with that notes object passed in, the new notes. And that's how it gets re-rendered every time. So we don't have to do anything special to check and see, is something changing? This connect, that's the portion of the connect that's like listen. It's listening for changes, and the notes store is telling it, yep, I changed, do something about it. The other half of that connect is allowing you to hooking up actions that will eventually trigger those changes. So connect sort of does two things. The first half is listen, and the second half is hooking up actions so that you can fire off changes. You could theoretically break that function down into two separate functions, where you could have a listen function and a separate, connect to action creators or something like that function, and bind your app to each one of those if you wanted.
It'll do the same thing.
It would just be more verbose. And what's happened is, there's still, this stuff's really young, so I can't say that all of this has been thought out in terms of what's the best way to hook some of these things up. But what you tend to have happen is anything that's reading from the store is frequently updating the store at the same time or wanting to do some sort of updates. So rather than splitting that out as two separate higher order component connectors, it makes a lot of sense to just be able to write that out as one line so that I don't have to write a couple separate lines to hook my app up. Does this make sense so far? Is it adding any clarity as we're hooking all this up again? I think this is a really powerful concept. It makes a lot of sense when you've worked in a lot of applications. It's not as obvious the first time you're building something. But if you've ever, this is a really powerful concept to learn, because when you start building applications and struggling with, oh man, my data is changing and I don't know where it's coming from, and it's really hard to track all these state changes, this sort of concept can help that a lot. It helps you really pinpoint where all your state changes are coming from. So once we've got that much hooked up, the rest of this chapter, and I already sort of bound the add note. I did this add note bit earlier because I preferred being able to see that, but the rest of this chapter is just sort of moving over the other actions that we have. Delete note and edit note, and sort of save the edited note using that same model. There's nothing dramatically different about any of the stuff that we're doing in those. So we're following that same sort of pattern. And if we go over and look at this alt now we're going to see something a little different than what we saw before. So let's refresh this and see what's happening in our states. So when we click this, we see global.create, and now we're seeing NoteStore. So that's sort of telling you NoteStore cares about this action.
So it's showing this last time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, last time we didn't have any store that cared about this create action. So it was telling you, yeah, nothing's hooked up to this right now. Nothing is changing as a result of this action. But now it's telling you the note store changed as a result of the action. And it shows you, if you went and look at your store, you can see here we've got these 3 items in it now, and it's handled this sort of dispatch of something changed my store. This guy, all right, he's only dispatched 1 item. He's got a couple things in there. NoteStore is subscribed to this create, but nothing else still. And if you look at your NoteStore, now we have 4 items in there and not the 3 that we had before. So we keep adding in more and more. I don't know what these buttons do. Oh, you could bootstrap something up. And you can also, and this is really cool, I'm going to make an assumption here. Oh, did that work? Let's see. Oh, I was hoping that would work a little differently than I thought. I guess I can't do that inside of here. I'm used to it inside of the Redux tools. You can actually reverse undo a dispatched action and just put your store back to the state it was before very easily inside of the Redux tools. I don't actually know what this icon does in this. I don't know. All right. Ignore that. There's something going on there, but it's not quite what I expected. Oh, that's weird. I mean, like I said, that's the crux of everything that we did here in this chapter. The other big change that happened, and we can talk about this a few different ways if you want to. We could even sketch some stuff out on the board. The other big change that we made was previously for our activate note edit and edit note, these were doing different changes in our store or in our state at that point, right? Activate note edit was just putting note.editing equal to true directly. And edit note was updating the task and the editing bits on the note action. Inside of our note store here, what's changed now instead is that those 2 functions are sharing one action that they're dispatching. They're both just dispatching this update action. And the reason that they're doing that, and this is an approach that there's different opinions on in a lot of these state management systems as to how to handle this, but they're giving the specifics inside of them about how you're going to change your object. So, oh, you want to change editing to be false and update the task. And here we want to change editing to be true. So they're telling you what change to make to the object and which object to change in your notes list. And what changed in the notes store is that this function that used to be very specific, so here it was very specific, note.editing, and even, oh yeah, the edit. Yeah, here we were updating items specifically. and even here we were updating it specifically, like editing equals true. Here we've made this more generic, where what it's doing is it's saying, oh, if you have the right note, what I want to do is just create, and we talked about this object.assign a little bit last time, create a new object, take all of the properties of the note that was there before for that object, whatever that object was before, and add in whatever properties got passed in for this operation. So for the two different items that are using that here, activate note edit and edit note, when you call activate edit note, the only thing getting passed into change is editing true. So if you have an existing note object, need better markers. If you have an existing note object, which has an ID of, I don't know, 42, and it had a task, it's not, yeah, the task is laundry, and that had a editing state of false. And it also has an ID inside of itself of 42 again. Then this object.assign, when you call, what is it called? Activate note edit. All it's passing in is an object that has editing set to true. And it basically takes these two objects and smashes them together with anything from this object overriding any properties in this one, and you get a new object out. So if we're looking at those two, what you'd say is, oh, the new object is going to have task of laundry, editing of true, because that's the new value, and ID of 42. That's your new object. And in the other case that we have, the edit note, instead of this being what it passes in this object with editing false and whatever the new task content is. And it just merges it into this again, overriding anything here with values that come from this if they exist. So, oh, editing is going to be false no matter what it was before, and the task is going to be this no matter what it was before, but the ID is still 42.
Hey, Jared, let me ask you this question then. In the default editing mode while we're talking about all this, when you are actually editing a note, and your state is true for the editing for that particular object, you can actually create a new note at that time, and it'll lose the focus. You know, you can't edit anymore. It'll take whatever you typed in at this point, and it'll actually save it for the task name, and it'll create a new note. But how does it go through and actually change the editing state to back to false? Because you're not in a editing mode anymore. So does it do that automatically?
Yeah, let's look at that. I think that's a great example of where you get value out of this right here, right? So let me refresh this because let me make sure I turned all this on and saved it. I don't know if I did. Oh, better save this. All right. Refresh this application. So let's start editing a note here, and what we'll see is the update action happened because we started to edit our note. And let's change it to Christmas shopping. And I'm going to click the add new note button up here. And what you'll see, hold on, I got lost in that, and it may be ordering them in a different order than I thought. Is it putting the newer ones up on top? It might be. So let me change this guy. I changed that to shopping. Yeah, it's putting the new ones on top. Okay, it's just in the opposite order than I expected. So what happens is it dispatches this update action because your focus changed. And that update action is the one that's being dispatched from edit note, because edit note gets called on blur, and blur happened when you clicked this button up here. Clicking this button makes your HTML element lose focus. So the first thing that happens is it calls edit note. That edit note passes in your new task, whatever the content of that thing is right now, along with editing of false, aka it's that second one down there, and updates your store accordingly, hence why you lose. It's no longer being edited, but the text changed. And then the next thing that happens is it dispatches this global, the create, because I clicked the button, which triggers create a new note, and that action fires. And so you can actually see, this is, again, like I said, one of the great things about this sort of approach is I can see exactly what happened in my application using this alt dev tools. It shows me the actions in the order that they occurred in. There's not, typically in a lot of applications for people who have done any significant amount of software development, that's a big black box at that point. Like this is where you put in a whole bunch of log statements or other things. Like I need to figure out the order of these sorts of actions happening. And we can get some of that really easily by having some dev tools that can inspect what's going on there. That's what you were asking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I think what I want to do is I'm going to take a short break. I go to the restroom real fast, and then we can come back and maybe together finish adding some settings capabilities into this, or maybe we'll only do part of that and might try and make it a stretch goal if people want to add in being able to change those settings a little bit more. But we'll proceed a little farther along this settings route so that we've got some of that stuff hooked up. And just as another example of working in this sort of model. All right. Be back in just a few minutes.
Still plenty of donuts. No, what happened?
I think it's way heavier than I thought. It's way heavier than I thought. All right, you guys ready to continue on doing some more of the settings connection?
Yeah.
So let's see how much of that we have hooked up so far. I can't remember. We've set a store, we've got a theme of some kind, and we have a font size. We're at least showing our font size here in our app, which is fine, which means we're getting it from our settings correctly. We've got some settings actions here. Update theme, update font size. Okay. What's the next step, you think, to get something hooked up here? What are we missing so far? Well, let's yeah, I mean we could. But let's not think we're gonna mean like another action. Like let's go back and look. We've got, if we have our pipeline here, which portions of this have we implemented so far for our settings store, and what are we missing in terms of implementing? We've got, yeah, well, yes, let's see here. We've got we're, at least for the font size, we're showing it, right? So we've got that, and we've got it hooked up. So we know we have these bits here, which means we also have the store. So this portion exists. That's great. Let's check and see if the view can dispatch an action. I don't think we're doing any of that right now, are we? So maybe let's add something to do that.
Plus and minus button for fonts.
That's what I'm thinking, right? Let's add a. I want this button. I'll just show them first. Let me just see if I can get them showing. And then I'll hook them up. Copy, because I'm a good developer, so I copy stuff all the time, even when I tell you never to copy code. Making the smallest changes I can. All right, I've got something here like decrease font size, increase font size. Yeah, maybe I just prefer change font size. And I'll just put them both together. This is just preference on the way it looks a little bit. How does that look? That seems good enough. So got change font size now. One of the great things about HTML is this doesn't even have to be on the same line. It doesn't matter. I want to hook these buttons up. So again, being a smart person and going, oh, I don't want to have to relearn how to do that. Oh, I've got a good model of how to hook something up here. So let's hook up my on-click for my decrease button. And what do I want to call what should we call the method to do that?
Decrease size.
Decrease font size. I mean, that works, right? Sure. So let's create this method. We want to do something in here. So you want to decrease our font size. All right. So this guy should get our font size, our current one, maybe. Well, let's just see if we can dispatch our action first. This dot props dot settings actions dot update font size, right? See if we can do that. All right, let's see what happens. We'll refresh the whole thing. Sweet. We're dispatching our action, so we know that much is happening. So let's go ahead and hook up increase as well. And again, why should I rewrite it when I can just copy and paste it? Increase font size. Let's just make sure that much is working before I do anything else. Might have something not working, or there we go. Looks like that one works too. So we know both those fire off the actions. Awesome. What's our next step here? Got a few things we can do. We can, oh, you mean have the store handle that action?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we don't have, yep. So if we're looking here. Yeah, we're at the step where we want our store to know what to do with this action. How do we change our store when that action comes through, right? So let's leverage our existing code. We want to bind our actions, right? Now we could bind these using different names if we want, or we can be a little lazy the same way that we did up there. This dot bind actions should work. Oh, it's not NoteActions that we're binding, is it? It's, oh, this is in the wrong place, isn't it? Oh, no, it's setting actions. This is the right place. But we already know it's a problem, right? What is that? Settings actions is not defined. Import it. Again, as lazy as can be. Oh, that didn't work the way I wanted. I don't know how to multi-select in here. So we import our settings actions. So we're bound now. Now what are our settings actions that we're bound to? Update theme and update font size, right? But the one that we're doing right now is update font size. So let's create a method inside of this. Has to have the same name because we use the convention version of bind actions. So it's automatically looking for something with this name. And to update our font size, we need to probably give it some value. What should we pass in as a parameter or an argument? We could pass nothing in, but what are we going to do to update our font size? All right, let's just do console.log first. Make sure that this is working, right? So let's give this a go. Ooh, awesome. It looks like it's bound to our settings store. Let's check our console. Update font size called. Yep. But it's not doing anything, right? So what do we want to do inside of here?
Like receive a number and then change its state.
Sounds logical to me. We can receive some sort of new number, right? Let's just call it font size. Let's call it font size. Then let's change our state. This dot, what part of this object? Settings, font size. Equals 42. No, it should definitely equal the new font size we passed in, not 42. I'm just going to say 42 right now. See what happens. Sweet, we changed our font size to 42. But we don't want to change it to 42. We want to change the font size, right? Whatever we pass in. So let's check it out and see what's happening. And uh-oh, font size is nothing. Why is that? We're not passing in anything. All right, so what do we want to pass into it to change our font size? Yeah.
I don't know if this would work, but for the decrease you want probably to figure out more or less than the original.
Well, we have access to the originals on our object here. That's just this dot props dot settings dot font size. And this is me being a lazy programmer. Instead of assigning it to a value, I'm just going to decrement it. And at first, I'm going to do this just to, I don't think this will work. We'll see. It might. Could be wrong. I'm going to find out. This dot props dot settings dot font size plus plus probably for this one. So let's see what happens. Re-render the whole thing just in case.
We need to do something with the font size.
It's not.
Calling it for like +1, -1.
I'm gonna try something here, and we'll see if this works. It might not. Oh, it is working now. Now this is one I wouldn't expect most people to catch right away. Why there would be a difference between these two? But when you're using this shorthand increment or decrement operator, there's a difference between putting it in front of the thing that you're incrementing and after. If you put it in front, it decrements and returns the new lower value, for example. But if you put it behind, it essentially returns the value like before decrementing and then decrements the value. And so what was happening before when we had it afterwards was it would say, oh, your font size is 16. So return 16, change the props font size to 16 or to 15, except you can't change your properties on a React component. And when we did that, it would go through this whole dispatch. The store would update this React component with the new font size, which is still 16 because it was the old number, and you wouldn't have changed. By putting it in front, it let me change the value first and give this the new lower value. You could easily have written that out more verbosely, right? You could have said, let new font size equals this dot props dot settings dot font size -1 or something as well. So it looks like we're all hooked up now for our font size changes. That's awesome. So I think what I'm going to do here is actually put this code up so that you guys, and then give you guys a reference to it as a separate branch so you guys can use it as a reference point. And unless you already had a stretch goal in mind for this, I think I might give them a stretch goal of hooking up the actual notes to the font size so that their text is in that font size. That way, now and then when you increment or decrement, you've got some setting you can change in your application. And if you really want to stretch yourself, you could try and implement the theming as well, where somebody could change the themes from maybe light to dark with some buttons, and maybe you change the CSS themes as well. A lot like you can do in Cloud9 here, where is it? Is it view? I can change my theme from a whole bunch of different themes really easily. And that may have been something that previously you guys may have never even thought of. Oh, how would I do something as complex as changing a theme like this? But now thinking about how you could do it with a Flux store, you could just store that value, pass that theme to a lot of different components that all look at it and go, oh, I've got this theme now, I change it to look this way. Now that's not ideal. We could talk about why you wouldn't want all these different components to have to change if you added another theme in the future. But that's at least shows you how you could propagate that sort of information down through your application very easily. There's no other questions. Right. Break, and if anybody has any individual help they need, any problems that they're stuck on, we can work through some of those. I'll get this branch posted up so that you guys can look at it as one sort of built on top of the other one, the NoteStore, and give that as a little bit of a stretch goal to try and implement it so you could change your font sizes with it. Other than that, on Tuesday, don't forget,